I introduced a Hebrew word to you, which was work. And this beautiful word here, just looking at the way it's written in Hebrew, is actually a really pretty word. And it's actually the word, the Hebrew way that the Jews spell Shabbat, which, it simply means rest. It comes from Shabbat. And, today we're going to be looking at the Sabbath in quite a bit of detail. And we're not really going to look at the right day and the wrong day and so on. We're going to experience and explore what comes out of out of our memory verse, which we'll just see in a minute. I wonder if someone can just read this memory verse for us. Any volunteer?
Sure, I will.
Thank you.
And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath.
Thank you, Cindy. What we'd like to focus on this week is just to explore the first part of this verse, which is the Sabbath was made for man. And the whole thing about this is, how was the Sabbath made for man? So looking at the various topics we're going to cover, we're looking at what the Sabbath is in terms of time, time to be astonished, for just rediscovery, learning priorities, finding balance, and community. And we're just going to go through each of these and see what each tells us. Each of these is one of the different categories through the week's lesson in our quarterly. The first thing is that the Sabbath points back to the most amazing creation week and establishes God as the all-powerful God, as our creator. When you think about this, was God not able to create everything together? Could he not have said one thing and everything just came into being in one instant? And I do believe he could. Of course he could. But he chose to actually create over 6 days. And then on the seventh day, he rested. God has a multiple agenda in everything he does. He has all sorts of layers to what he does, how he plans things. I should say they, because Elohim, the word for God in the Bible, is plural. And, the whole thing about time, excuse me, is that when God created the universe and the sun and the moon and the earth and their spinning cycles, each of those establishes time in a very tangible way, in the sense that here is nature keeping time in a certain way. But nowhere, anywhere in nature is the phenomenon of a 7-day period. Nothing establishes that from a natural point of view. In fact, many people in the world have experimented with different days. China was experimenting with 10 days in a week, a cycle of 10. But invariably, with all of the experimentation, it all came and just didn't work. People got too tired and it just sort of didn't work. And the whole world now works on a 7-day cycle. One of my loves is nature, and it's really just, when we talk about Sabbath being a time to be astonished and pointing back to creation, one of my favorite topics is just digging into the very amazing facts in creation. And each of you listening to me right now, you have more cells in you than you can even imagine. This is like the sands of the sea, so many cells in each of us, that it's just incredible when you consider our eyes and so on. But this isn't really what I'd like to focus on now. I'd like us to just consider this, and could you respond to this? What are some of the activities that continue weekly about the Sabbath that we could and should enjoy to do on the Sabbath? This is, what can we do to continue being astonished? Or what are some of the things? And I've given some topics here But is there anyone that has any comments on any one of these which could reveal how we could be and continue to be astonished on Sabbath especially? So when I talk about this, I'm talking about some activities we could do, some of the things we could focus on. To focus on God and nature are some of the more sort of self-evident areas of focus where we could and should be active. But I'd like to sort of suggest that we could and should explore into some of these other areas of focus. So the Sabbath is a day where we stop our business work and we tend to and want to and should focus on more of the other aspects of what we encounter and what the world is all about. And, you know, one of the things that we very seldom do is to spend time on our own, away from our families and our work and all of our efforts. And I'd like to suggest that, you know, just contemplating oneself, your relationship with God, how God has helped you as a person across your life, and you just contemplate how God is involved and you want him to be involved. This is a wonderful exercise to be involved in very early on a Sabbath morning when perhaps the rest of the family is asleep, and you just focus on yourself for a minute. Family as well, community. Any comments on this section? Very quiet out there.
I think often we don't truly understand what the Sabbath was really meant for. And as I see it having changed pre and post sin, and then even in heaven, the world today speaks a lot about mindfulness and about living in the present. And I believe that psychology has opted for that because of the recognition that we are so trapped in worrying about the future and the past that we don't actually live in the moment. And we often find ourselves mindless rather than mindful. And the Sabbath to me is about that mindfulness. It's about, instead of my walking the same route to work every day and being completely zoned out to miss the fact that there are beautiful flowers or new plants or new people, God is saying, I need you to stop and just enjoy the moment. I need you to stop worrying, and I need you to be focused and deliberate in being astonished and amazed at what I have put around you and how I have provided for you. In the same way that ancient Israelites, when they first started hoarding the manna and then found that those who hadn't picked enough actually had enough. They had more than enough. And those that had picked too much also just had enough. So it was, to me, it's about God teaching us to live in the moment, to have that psychological balance and to be deliberately mindful.
You may be surprised that I've actually included work here as one of the elements to be astonished about on a Sabbath. And we are told not to work on the Sabbath. So what did I mean by bringing it in? All of these are very closely linked, yourself, your family, your community, and your work. And work has a very spiritual dimension, which warrants a bit of focus on Sabbath. Not so much about the detail of the work, but more about the work you have, the influence of it in your life and your family, the influence God has on your work, and how you actually are astonished at how God actually works out the elements of your work, your activities, your progress, the challenges you have. And this is one of the areas where, from a spiritual point of view, I believe that God really wants us to also to be involved on the Sabbath with work, looking at it from a spiritual point of view and a thankful and a more involved, linking Him back to your work and praying for the next 6 days of what your work will be. I'd like to continue then on to the next section. So, looking at the Sabbath in terms of a time for rediscovery, and Cher just mentioned the story of the manna. I thought I'd give it in a form of a couple of questions. So does anyone know what the word manna actually means?
What is this?
Yeah, it actually sounds like a really nice word in English, but it's like, what is this? When was manna actually given? So we know that it was given during the time of Israel walking through the desert. There was no food there. And we know that they spent a long time in the desert. But how often was it given? See, no one's really in the mood to talk. So
it was given for every day, and if you kept what you had from the one day, it would go off, and when it got to Friday, you could take double the portion, so that you had something to eat on Sabbath and you didn't have to fast.
Awesome. Okay. So it was given in the morning, and it didn't last for too long because the sun would melt it. So people would have to go out in the morning and collect it. It lasted just for that one day, as Frank says. And then on the seventh day, there was no manna. No manna fell from heaven. And this was a distinct and so a very obvious indication that the seventh day was different and special. On the sixth day, as we've just heard, a double portion came down or was on the ground, and people were required to actually collect on the sixth day for the seventh day. So this gave an indication of how God intended one to prepare for the Sabbath, and that's basically the physical aspect of how it worked. Was manna? Sorry, Frank.
Can I mention one thing on that, which I thought was good? If you did the reading with the lesson study, it says they went out on Sabbath to go and check if they would collect stuff. So I bet you the first Sabbath, there were quite a few people that had the stuff stink the second day that thought, no ways, they don't trust this. They're going to not collect it and let it stink and get worms and that. Therefore, they're going to collect it on Sabbath. So they go out to collect on Sabbath. So they had a hungry day, and they learned their lesson like human beings do by mistake.
Brilliant. And that too was then a lesson in obedience, to follow the actual, to do exactly what God tells you to do. Don't come up with your own stuff. We know that this actually happened before Sinai. So it wasn't that God suddenly created the Sabbath when he did the 10 Commandments. We have, it's not totally clear, but it was fairly understood that the Sabbath was kept from the very first time God created it on the seventh day right through up to today. So there was no real break. But the Israelites spent a lot of time in Egypt, and the Sabbath was actually lost to them. One of the things about being a slave was that they had to do what their bosses told them. In fact, there's a little narration in the Bible about some of the Jews wanting to keep the Sabbath and trying to make this part of their behavior as Jews. And in reaction, the Egyptians actually withdrew the straw, and then they were supposed to find the straw and make the bricks. So the Sabbath had been present in the Jews' minds and in the Israelites while they were slaves. What lessons were taught through the manna about God? What can you come up with that God is actually trying to teach them with the specific thing about manna? And looking at this as being the time, Sabbath being a time for rediscovery, you know, in the light of that, any thoughts about what the lessons were relating to manna?
I think one lesson could be that was to trust in God, that He would provide for them, He would keep His word and give what was promised.
That's absolutely a very robust answer to this question. So on the one hand, God was trying to teach them something about the Sabbath, but his main lesson was that he was their father. He was their guardian. He was totally there for everything that they needed. You know, it wasn't only about the manna. Their tents lasted forever. Their clothes lasted forever. Not forever, but for all the time. Their shoes, all of the things around them didn't decay. They didn't deteriorate. They didn't have to go and set up ways in which to clothe themselves or to house themselves. And here was the way that they would be fed every day, literally fed by God. So thanks, Cindy. That's an awesome answer. Any other lessons anyone can think of?
Joel had his hand up.
I'm not able to see everyone, so could you just talk as you have something to say? I'd be so glad if you did that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay. It's pretty much the same as what Cindy was saying, but recently I was reading in Luke, and this just made me think of that. The one verse, Jesus says, "Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds." So I was just thinking, perhaps with the manna, God was, like Cindy said, teaching that we need to depend on God and that God actually values us enough to care for us day to day, rather than us trying to store up things to prepare for our future. God will prepare for our future for us.
Thanks, Joel. That's an awesome answer. Just a point on. Sure, go ahead.
I'd like to add to even what Joel and them were saying is that so much of our life is dependent on us providing for ourselves. If we think about it, that's all we work for, is to provide food and shelter and clothing for ourselves. And then when we have extra, we give others. But in the world today, how many people's self-worth is determined by that? How many people lose their self-worth and their mental health when they lose their work and their assets? And this, to me, is God's way of reminding us that He is actually our provider. He's the one in which we have intrinsic value, not even our ability to provide. And I think that for us is a critical thing to, and that's what the Sabbath is about, is to recognize God's hand of provision in the week that has preceded.
Absolutely, thank you. Just a comment about the birds and God feeding them and so on. The interesting thing about birds and nature as a whole is that they're actively pursuing their nourishment and they're actively pursuing their protection and their nests and so on. So it's not as if you know, they're just sitting there and God's giving them food. It's a combination of industry and busyness, but the birds and nature trust and know inherently and instinctively that there is food. And it's that combination that I believe God wants us also to remember, that trust in God that we will be looked after, but there is the activity that he wants us to do to actually earn that. As we saw last week, work is service, and payment then is for the service. The other thing, just very quickly, just so that we can move on a bit, is that one of the lessons that was taught here was obedience. As Frank said, you know, people were experimenting with, okay, if I don't do this and I do that, not quite following what God was saying, would it still work? And if consistently and without fail, if they went out on the seventh day, there was nothing. And if they didn't collect enough on the sixth day, they wouldn't have enough for the next day. So obedience is one of them. And here we see the joint characteristic of God being care and mercy and grace on the one side, and the expectation of obedience and work on the other side, being the balancing actions. So what is we covered a bit about what about this is relevant to us today, thanks to Joel and Shay. I just want to go to this side of it, where the rediscovery is that the Sabbath is actually, and God said these words, the Sabbath is a sign between me and them. I think one of the things that really set the Jews apart, and one of the things that sets us apart as Adventists, is the Sabbath. But let's just get some thoughts on how does the Sabbath set us apart. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Cliff, if I may just say something, and it's a little bit back from where you came, but I think relevant to what you're saying. If I decide to do something on a Friday night that is not in line with Sabbath keeping, I go and look for my own manna, or I go and do my own work, I don't drop dead immediately. But the path that I've chosen becomes worn into my life, where I went to school at an Adventist school, sat next to a young guy. We were best of friends, and he wound up committing the biggest robbery in South African history at that point, heist. And I say, how did it get to that point? And it got to that point one step at a time, where he revolted against his conscience. And God says, I talk to you with my still small voice. I don't thunder and shout at you every day, because God wants to be able to trust us for eternity. And if he's going to trust us for eternity, he's got to, and he gives us freedom of choice in heaven. We've got to be able to make the right choices. And the Sabbath is there for me to worship him in the way that he would like me to worship him, and for me to listen to my conscience and to listen to his still small voice as he directs me in the paths he wants me to go. So that's where the Sabbath comes in different. I know many of my Sunday keeping friends, they go to service on Sunday and you see them afterwards and they're building at home, or they've missed out on that still small voice of God that talks to you and prepares you for eternity.
Thank you, Frank. I think that's a great story and a great example. You know, what's really true about the Sabbath is that it's not really, and I don't really want to say this like this, but if you kill, that's tangible. If you steal, it's tangible. If you do some of these other things, they're very tangible, and they affect the rest of society quite tangibly. The Sabbath is an interesting one, where, and this is where I'd like to get to my next comment below here, which is about obedience. The Ten Commandments actually manifest themselves in what you do, but they are they're an outward test of an inner commitment. So the consistency of obedience is very closely linked to the inner commitment that one has. And that inner commitment is there's this phrase where, what do you do when no one's watching? And that's the extent of this kind of inner commitment, where it doesn't matter whether someone's watching or not, whether there are implications or not. It's just a commitment to God's commandments, because this is how you accept that God wants you to behave for your own good and the good of society around you, and into the future, where you, as Frank says, are not a danger to the way things work, because you're not a loose cannon that's going to decide to do stuff contrary to how God's great government of love works, and then be a danger to yourself and everyone else. I'd like to move on. If there's any other comment on the slide, please talk now. Okay, so one of the other things about the Sabbath and making the Sabbath a delight, I've actually got this running on each slide at the top there, and we're going to talk about this comment in this slide. Now, what was interesting about the Sabbath and the way the Jews kept the Sabbath during the time of Jesus, and we often sort of say, what? How could the Jews come up with so many rules? In fact, they had over 600 rules on how the Sabbath should be kept. But it's historic. Before the Babylonian captivity, the Israelites were becoming more and more lax about obeying God. They started worshiping idols. And the whole inner commitment that I spoke about in the previous slide was that the inner commitment was not there anymore. And it showed itself in various ways. And keeping the Sabbath was one of the big evidences of breaking of that inner commitment breaking down. So one of the things about carrying burdens was that a burden was linked to what Jews did for business. They were carrying their merchandise in and out. They were taking their merchandise to somebody. They would be taking the merchandise they bought from somebody, bringing it back. So the whole thing about carrying burdens was linked to business work. And what was interesting is that it got to the place where Jeremiah actually stood in the gate on Sabbath, and he would actually warn people about who were carrying burdens up and down through the gate, back and forth. There were these merchants outside of the wall. At that time, the merchants who were not Sabbath keepers would actually also come into the cities. And after numerous warnings and all of this, in fact, it was prophesied, and eventually it came to being, that the whole of the Jewish nation virtually was carried off to Babylon as captives, and they ceased to be a people other than the remnant, a tangible nation. They were actually sort of brought into virtual extinction by the Babylonians, and this was the result, that they were actually taken off into captivity. After captivity, when they all came back again, it started up again. They started forgetting the Sabbath, doing business on the Sabbath, and Nehemiah actually closed the gate, and he warned them that in fact, he warned the merchants outside that if they stayed outside and they were trying to do business, he would actually lay hands on them, get physically involved. And because of this kind of history of the Jewish nation and the captivity and so on, the Jews developed, very rigid rules, trying to ensure that there was no way that Jews would actually break the Sabbath. Some of these rules were quite ridiculous. They weren't allowed to walk, through a field where the grain wasn't very high, because their clothes could touch it, and this would be some form of reaping the crop off the not the tall crop. And one of the other rules was that you shouldn't really be combing your hair on Sabbath, because this would be some kind of shredding where some of your hairs would come out as you're combing your hair. There were really, those are the two that I remember, but there were very many more. So one sort of doesn't really blame the Jews at the time of Christ for their specific insistence that the Sabbath should be kept very rigidly. But on the other hand, this was them really making the Sabbath a total burden and making the priority on keeping the law rather than serving God. So I don't know if there's anything someone wants to make a comment someone wants to make on what I've just said.
May I say something, seeing I say so little?
Thanks, Frank.
Each of us have the challenge of wanting to live in a laissez-faire. I do what I want to and God's going to save me. And each of us also want a checklist, the legalistic checklist, that I've done everything that I should do, and because I've done everything I should do, I'm going to be saved. Now, none of those extremes will save a person. And that was what Israel was before captivity, and that was Israel after captivity. They ticked the boxes. And each of us have the challenge in our own life. Do we live laissez-faire and expect God to save us? He's got to trust that laissez-faire attitude through eternity, and he knows that we'd be very unhappy with it. If we have the checkbox religion, we're going to be so legalistic that we're never going to enjoy the freedom of heaven. So God gives us the two, we've got the two extremes. We've got to, for ourselves, learn to walk in neither extreme and listen to the still small voice of God and trust his abiding presence to guide us in our lives.
I like that contrast between laissez-faire and checkbox. And I'd like to add, and this is my opinion, that neither in the laissez-faire approach nor in the checkbox approach is any evidence of a relationship with God. These are long-distance, arm-length relationships with God where it's, ooh, God is so forgiving, he'll just let it go. Or that he's so demanding, but there is a total lack of understanding of who God actually is and what his character is and how he relates to people. So getting back to long before both Jeremiah and Nehemiah was Isaiah. And Isaiah, then already Sabbath was a problem. And he was saying to the Israelites then, if you come back to the Sabbath and you decide not to do your own pleasure on the Sabbath, this is your work pleasure, but make it a delight to put God first. So this is actually where the relationship kicks in. When you actually put God first and you have an emotional investment in that, and you actually put God first, this is where he will bless you richly, not because you're obedient, but because, and think of this, if you spend 24 hours every week in the presence of God, something rubs off. There are things about God's presence, his truth, his nature, his blessing, his guidance that comes when you actually spend time with him. And God knew that we'd be busy, we'd be actively involved in all sorts of things, and we'd be pressured by various, it's almost like God set up the Sabbath for a sin situation, as well as it being something before sin. It's set up for being the remedy and the balm that nourishes us on a weekly basis. So this particular verse is the one to contemplate going forward. How can I make a delight in the Sabbath? Not only the Sabbath, but actually obeying all his commandments. How can that be a delight? David speaks about in the Psalms that he contemplates and has joy thinking about the law of God. And it's more about him realizing a relationship in obeying God. You know, when you look at and remember some of our younger kids when they were really not as independent and self-aware, they would actually delight in doing anything you ask them to do as your parent or as their guardian, their parent or their guardian. And there was this thing about, you know, asking them to do something, and they would, out of love, because there was this, you know, innocent relationship between you, that there would be this kind of reaction. And this is, I think, what Jesus meant when he said, except you become as little children, you will not see the kingdom of God, because there's this dependence and love and realization of who God actually is in our lives. Down the side here, on the right-hand side, I just have a couple of questions. How does our behavior reveal our priority to God? And then what about jobs and deadlines and loss of money? There are all these threats to us who keep the Sabbath. And then there's the question about is doing other pleasure than work pleasure okay? And then finally, how do you decide what is right and wrong activity on the Sabbath? How did David decide it's okay to go and eat the bread out of the sanctuary? How did Jesus decide that it's okay for his disciples to thresh the wheat on the Sabbath? So if you have any comments or answers to any one of these, that'll really be great. Anyone from the class trying to pick up on anything on this slide?
I find it interesting that in different cultures, they keep the Sabbath very differently. And I think some of us may be shocked. So I'm not going to share some of it because we don't want to create unnecessary problems. But it can be a really dark rabbit hole to go down. And I think what Frank was saying particularly just strikes with me. You know, the reason God had to give rules and what the Jews call the 10 statements and all the supporting sub breakdowns of those rules is because the people had mentally and spiritually and psychologically gone down to that slave mentality. And they needed all this black and white to a great extent. And that's why we probably have laws as well. But nobody needs to tell me what my marital responsibilities are. And I don't even look at them as responsibilities because I love my husband. Nobody has to tell me, phone your parents at least once a week to find out if they're okay and how they're doing. Because I am in relationship with them. And I think that those rules are there as reminders or barriers on almost like a minimum standard. And so when it comes to keeping Sabbath holy and celebrating it, because it really was about the celebration, it's about planning. And I can say that planning when the sun sets on Saturday evening for the next Sabbath, what you're going to eat as a family, who you're going to have over, what activities you're going to do to bless others. That is what makes the Sabbath something to look forward to. And I think that is our responsibility. The creeping compromise that Frank spoke about doesn't happen as easily when we are deliberate in planning the pleasure of the next Sabbath.
Thank you, Cher. Some really insightful, and thanks for breakfast this morning. I think I want to move on because time is marching. So there's quite a lot of rich topics and discussion. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment on that. My name is Phil Mashoko. I think one of the things that we should try to do is to be satisfied with what we have done in the 6 days for us to enjoy the Sabbath. If you look at the Lord, when he did the creation, he rested and he was satisfied with all the creation that he had done in these 6 days. He didn't create after the 7th day. He was happy with what he had done and he rested. So challenge that we have most of the time is that we don't plan, we don't get satisfied with what the Lord has given us or what we have done in the 6 days for us to enjoy the Sabbath.
That's an amazing point you just made. I've never really heard it that way. Thank you so much. It's actually a huge point to contemplate because, as you say, if you haven't planned well in the 6 days, you feel desperate to try and finish off stuff on the Sabbath, and that just messes up everything. Thank you. Really appreciate that.
Cliff, can I tell you about the Pharisee Frank Bell?
Yeah, I don't know him that well.
Like every good Pharisee, I got up early on Sabbath and I brushed my teeth, combed my hair, and put my Sabbath clothes on, and went to Sabbath school and got involved in Sabbath school and taught the youth Sabbath school at this was at Sunnyside in the Transvaal in Pretoria. And after that, we went and we invited a whole lot of young people to our house, and we had a whole lot of young people over, and I entertained them while Annette ran around and did the food, like I think she'd done a few times after that. And when we had finished, later in the afternoon, we went our ways and we had Sabbath closing. However, in that same church was a little old lady. And that Sabbath, as she walked home, she realized that the people along the river were going to be flooded out. So she got home and she put her gumboots on and her raincoat on, and she went down to the little homes along the river and helped them with their flooding.
Wow.
Now, who was sensitive to what God wanted them to do on his Sabbath? The Pharisee had a lot of fellowship, but the little old lady had God's inspiration in her life.
Frank, I think maybe you're being a little unfair on yourself there, not because you are Frank and you're talking about yourself, but I think God has different things happening at the same time. You know, you bringing those people home, and I like this about you and the way you do things, is to be sensitive to what you can do for others. So I think you were both equally blessed and not quite pharisaical there. I'm pretty sure if you guys had some indication of something going down at the river, you'd have all rushed down there. But thank you for the various points. They all have, you know, quite a bit of meat in them. I just want to carry on to the other sections. So if you don't mind, I see time marching on. One of the things about the Sabbath is also a time for reflection and a time for finding balance. And I think what we've been talking about now has already set the tone for recognizing that there is a balance between laws and relationships. In fact, Frank's point just a minute ago speaks directly to this. And one of the things I thought you were beginning to say, Frank, was that many of us are so involved with church stuff, and you know, it just becomes a work as well, and we're so busy doing the work of keeping the Sabbath and being involved in church and doing the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, the honor Sabbath, that we don't actually have time to focus on what I believe God really wants, is that He wants to fellowship with us one-on-one. You know, we need to actually keep and get in touch with Him as a good relationship would do. We spend time actually really just focusing on Him and allowing Him to focus on us. So, you know, the balance there is also between good people doing good things, but being over busy You know, there's this whole phenomenon of preachers' kids, and in a way, I'm one of the sort of examples of a phenomenon like that, where one's parents are so busy with doing church stuff, and you just get dragged along. I'm not making a criticism, please. They did great stuff, and they did great stuff for us as well. But it is possible where one just misses each other. And this is where I just wanted to touch on this. The fact is that Sabbath was also there, and especially in finding balance, and we'll touch on it in the next point as well, where Sabbath is there to actually bring healing. It's a period of time where we can actually, and thanks so much for the point earlier, where we can actually say, you know what, I've done my best, and now I'm going to take a rest and get that healing, which is actually a rejuvenation, the rejuvenation of your energies. Your body has interesting ways of rejuvenating itself. And I think the cycle of 7 days is exactly that, where God knew that if we take that break, a weekly break for a whole 24 hours, we would actually have the rejuvenation that we physically need. But this is the other thing, that I don't think Sabbath should be that busy. There shouldn't be all these things happening, next thing, because this is a time for families, and this is a time for visiting the poor and the people in hospital, and you know, going as and doing some form of the lady going down the river helping people kind of stuff. So these are just some of the thoughts on this slide. Are there any points that any of you want to bring up? I had this thing about, you know, looking through the eyes of Jesus when you look at the law, not being judgmental. So if you see your fellow Sabbath keeper going into a shopping mall on Sabbath, you know, what is your first reaction, and should you be doing anything? Should you be talking to him? You know, stuff like that. Any comments on the slide from anyone? There are a lot of stuff going on here. Just any thoughts you want to share? There's so much juice in this lesson. Okay, if not, just quite a few Sabbaths ago, I couldn't really fit it in, but I was going to go to the shopping mall on Sabbath to donate some blood, because that is where they are. And then we decided, you know, for the weaker brother's sake, perhaps we should just go the next day. But yeah, there could be all sorts of reasons for that kind of thing as well. So just the last point, God definitely intended the Sabbath for us getting together. You know, Isaiah says, my house is a house of prayer for all nations. And we have numerous accounts in the Bible of Jesus going to the synagogue, Paul going to the synagogue, the disciples and other followers all meeting at the synagogue, because this is actually what God intended, that people get together and spend some time together, sharing the word, listening to his word. And, you know, one of the big things that Satan actually invented was the concept of I need, I want. If I don't feel like it, I want. And it's the big thing, the big change that comes into one's mind and heart is when you accept Jesus, you actually accept that you're part of a community of believers, and you believe and share. So this is one of the ways in which the Sabbath is a great way to teach others about God as well, where you come together. So this is one of the big characteristics of God's people, where on a Sabbath, they all congregate together. The whole thing of keeping the Sabbath for 24 hours, the whole thing about keeping the Sabbath on the seventh day, you know, all of these activities actually make and set apart. You'd be surprised at how people watch you and wonder about your behavior and are affected by what you do. especially when it's different to what they do. And then they see the quality of work that you do, they see the quality of your health, they see the way you treat other people. It all links together into a story about you as a Christian person, obeying God, having a relationship with God. And the Sabbath is the culmination and the pinnacle of this beautiful structure of character that God built in us. I'm going to share very quickly. I don't know if you know this, but Cher first introduced me to it, and this happens in virtually every Jewish home, where they open Sabbath almost start an hour before Sabbath. They're already ready, and on a on a Friday evening, they have this beautiful meal together. It's the tables are elegantly set. The families sit down and sing and congregate together and share inspiring thoughts. They bless their children every week, and there's a whole ritual around welcoming the Sabbath and so on. So while we're critical of the Jews and the way they keep the Sabbath, those are rules which shouldn't be there, of course. But this particular tradition every week, where this type of activity, and very often we rush into Sabbath, we just barely make it before the sun goes down, and we hasten to say things and do things. But perhaps, Frank, we can actually do this kind of thing on Zoom, where each family is around a table and eating a meal and sharing this kind of thing. Just a thought. So just to wrap up, I don't know if anyone has an experience that you want to share quickly about Sabbath being good or bad for you in any way, and also how can we specifically make the Sabbath a delight? I think this is something that as individuals and as a family, we should actually sit down and plan properly. Let's decide to be intentional about keeping the Sabbath, intentional about keeping the Sabbath a delight, and how we can, especially with children and family, bring about the healing parts of Sabbath. I don't know if anyone wants to make a final comment here.
I think one of the Bible verses that stands out for me is that verse, I think it's in Luke, Acts, where we're told that it's more blessed to give than to receive. And I think that is what the Sabbath is about, to give relief, to give help, to give a listening ear. You know, Jesus did awesome miracles on the Sabbath as well. And I think just hearing last night, the speaker last night, by just giving that tiny bit of advice, a person who's struggling terribly and they're so close to their problem, they don't even realize that the only problem that they have is that they're not drinking sufficient water, but now they're in pain. It's these things, you know, when Auntie Ellen tells us that the health message will be the right arm of the gospel as it goes forward. We have an understanding of the human body and how God created us that others possibly don't have. And so it's all of these things that we have a privilege to share with others on the Sabbath. And so instead of only taking our lay activities nap on a Sabbath afternoon, maybe we should be scheduling how we can just go into the community or into an old age environment or whatever and just bless others with a listening ear, with a little gift that we've made, something we've baked. You know, just ask God, how can we use the talents he's given us to minister to others?
Thank you very much, and this is where we end the lesson. I just have a comment. Yes, please.
Can I interrupt a sec? I just think it's fantastic that we as a little group have got someone like Phil Mashorka, who commented earlier. He's been in isolation in a hospital in Cape Town for 3 months already. and he's got maybe another month and a half in isolation, no person contact. It's through suits and whatnot, if I understand it right. But fantastic that as a little community, we can invite someone like that into our group on a Sabbath to enjoy a blessing with us. During the week, he's working, he's in charge of the revitalization of Cape Town. So he's a busy man, but fantastic that on a Sabbath, we've got him here with us. And even though he's in isolation, he's working flat out during the week.
No wonder he feels that he's done a good work over 6 days. Thank you so much. We are truly honored to have such a wide variety of people joining us. And I really did just wish that more people would comment. It's been very, very quiet, but thanks for that comment, Frank, and thank you for joining us, Dr. Mashoko. Just a final comment, and this is, I think, sometimes one feels this, where you are prepared and everything's done and you're ready to enter the Sabbath with peace and calm. I'm sure this has happened to a lot of us, at least at some point. And then when Sabbath closes, you actually just don't really want to start working yet or doing anything business-wise or secular, because you've really just been basking in the glow of God's presence. And this is what I wish for us going forward with every Sabbath, and truly developing slowly but surely that relationship with God, where the Sabbath does become a delight. And as I say, and as Isaiah says up here, it's actually when you spend that time in God's presence that it's not that God specifically blesses you. He does, I believe he does. But because of you being, it's almost like a natural consequence that you are blessed. And this is where I believe a lot of one's spirituality lies, in keeping the Sabbath as a delight. And this is the one thing I'd like to leave us with a thought, is to how can we actually experience God more, deeper, and you know, just share that with others as well. Thank you so much for listening. I wonder if I could just say a prayer to close the session. Our dear Father in heaven, thank you so much that we can spend time every week, every Sabbath, listening to your word, thinking about what you have to say to us. And as we've gone through this lesson, I do hope that your message about what you really intend for the Sabbath for each of us has come through, and that we have some basis to think about how we can serve you more intentionally and to be of a service and blessing to others. Listening to your still small voice as to what we should do, where we should do it, and follow your leading in every aspect of our lives. Thank you so much, Lord, and I pray this in Jesus' name.